And we have a group of folks who are working on preparing for a celebration for the 300th anniversary of the Plains Cemetery this year. The group is a mixed group of folks from the Heritage Commission, the Historic District Commission, the Historical Museum Commission, the trustees of the trust funds, actually the cemetery trustees, the library, and the Department of Public Works. And we planned several events for this year for the cemetery. It's, as I say, the 300th anniversary of the cemetery. We're also members of a larger group of folk who are working on the cemetery to actually help to rehabilitate it. What we're involved in now is cleaning the cemetery, the gravestones in the cemetery. We're resetting some of the smaller gravestones that are leaning. We're collecting a lot of data as we clean the stones to identify who the individuals are, the iconography, and all kinds of information from those stones, so we can put that into a database for public availability. We're also, we have some folks who are doing some research for us also as we clean the stones and gather the data if we need more data regarding the military experience of the individuals and so forth. They're doing that. So we got a lot going on with this project, but the main thing that we're looking at right now is the several events that we have planned to celebrate the 300th anniversary. The Plains Cemetery, back several years ago, the town got a grant from the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources to hire an architectural historian to write a nomination of the cemetery to the National Register of Historic Places. And it was listed on the National Register in December of 2021. So that was quite an honor to have that listed on the National Register of Historic Places. We have 5 historic register structures here in the town, and the Plains Cemetery is probably one of the least known when you come down to it, but on the other hand, it's probably one of the more important of the structures listed on the National Register because of its importance to the town from the standpoint of its relationship to the development of the town and the people who are buried there. And Melissa's going to talk about that tonight, and that'll be the focus of this. Let's see, that's pretty much where we are. I would like to thank the Friends for the food tonight. That was very thoughtful of them to provide that for us, and so help yourself to that when the presentation's over. This is being videotaped, and it'll be put on the town's website. Hopefully none of you mind being on a videotape. If you do, just keep your back of your head to the camera. I don't like being videotaped. I don't like being photographed, so if you feel that way, I know exactly how you feel. So anyway, that's about it. I'd like to introduce Melissa. I think probably all of you know Melissa, our library director. She will be doing a presentation tonight. And so Melissa, thank you for preparing this, and thank you for doing it. Thank you all for being here.
Good evening. I am so excited to be here because gravestones are, believe it or not, one of my very favorite things. I did a major presentation and report on it in college, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I got to present it at Caltech University. So this is kind of bringing me back to my roots because I was in college 30 years ago. It is very exciting to be part of this project. Thank you, Ernie, for teaching me how to clean gravestones, something I've always wanted to do. My talk tonight is not going to focus on what I've written in the exhibit because you can go around and read that, and I didn't want to repeat it. So I'm going to talk about why I love gravestones, why I love cemeteries, why I think everybody should, what is so special about them, and I'm going to share some of my background a little bit with you. So thank you, Evie Nathan, who is not here tonight, who sent us this picture when she found out what we were doing, and she said, I've got a great picture. And I think it really is great because it really sets the tone for what we feel when we're in a graveyard, that feeling of solemnity and beauty and pride, and a little bit of spookiness. She's got some, you can see there's some webs there. So in our town, and in most New England towns, it begins with a church and a cemetery. Usually the church and cemetery go hand in hand, and the beginning of the exhibit talks about that. It starts with the families who come to a place, farmers and businessmen in this town. That's how we started. So my honors thesis at UNH was called Gravestones, a Reflection on American Lifestyles, and it was based on my art history degree. My professor, Mara Witzling, in my American art history class, was going through regular art, like paintings, all of that, and then all of a sudden she posted a gravestone. Now, I had visited many graveyards with my dad, who was a big history person, but I never really thought about them as art until Professor Witzling. And I got very excited, and that's what started me on my journey. And I started talking about how the art reflects how Americans' ideas about our society changed over time. In our next exhibit, we're doing 3 this year. So this one, to get us started, to talk about the town, to talk about why the cemetery is important. The second one is going to be on what we call gravestone iconography, which is the images. And then the third one is going to be on the process of preserving our graveyard. So I started studying the images on gravestones and what they meant, and I hope you come back for the second exhibit to learn more about that. We're not going to talk about that today, but most of my research was in Portsmouth. Portsmouth and Kingston had a really strong connection because one of the major routes all the way from Georgia came up to Portsmouth for a trade route, and Kingston was right in the middle of that, which I didn't know when I did this paper, but I did a lot of research in the past month, and it really helped me expand my ideas from what I learned about Portsmouth to understand Kingston's role. I have notes, and I was doing this without my notes. You should be impressed. So I hung out in graveyards on my weekends. I took that art history class as a sophomore. I was dating this guy, and he was going to Boston University, I was going to UNH, and sometimes I'd go to Boston, sometimes he'd come up, and I said, okay, we're going to take the train and we're going to visit all the graveyards up and down the coast. And he's like, all right, let's go. So he had a little stick, and those of you who have been out cleaning gravestones or resetting them know that sometimes the words and the images are below the ground. So my business major boyfriend would scrape away the ground so I could see what was underneath. And we've been married for 30 years, and he still has that stick. This is the Portsmouth graveyard, which has been in disrepair for quite a while. They're working really hard to fix up their own graveyard. I had a picture of my then boyfriend sitting on this tomb. I forgot to look for it last night, but it's funny because in the top left you'll see there's a person over there, which I didn't notice when I picked that picture off the internet. So part of my work as an undergrad, I decided, I'm going to be clever. I'm doing all this research on gravestones. I'm going to write about gravestones for every single class I can possibly write about. So for my American history class, I wrote about how gravestones reflected men's and women's roles. For example, the way families are buried, the man is always on the same side as when they're married, and the woman's always on the same side. So that was great. I got an A on that. And then I took a folklore class, which is about oral history and storytelling, and we had to do our own project for that. We had to interview our friends. And I decided I was going to interview about their beliefs about graveyards. And that's what this talk, I would say, is mainly about, what our beliefs are. The one that stuck out for me, because most of them said, oh, they're spooky, oh, I don't want to go near them, oh, they're depressing. But one boy said to me, I played in the graveyard. It was right next door to my house. So for him, it was like a playground. we don't want kids playing near the stones, but I liked that idea of a graveyard as a special place, as a place where we could be happy and not necessarily sad. In fact, in May, we are going to have a celebration on the plains, and we're hoping to have a picnic, because it was very common to have picnics in the graveyard then, because we want to celebrate our ancestors, and we want to celebrate that sense of pride. It shouldn't necessarily be a depressing place. So here are some of our founders of Kingston. When we go to the cemetery, we have strong ties to our kin, to the founding fathers and others buried in these places, but we often pay them little mind. I think because you're here, you value this already. I imagine that's why you're here, but many people don't. Few of us really take the time to appreciate the history and value of these places and the people within them. I like to think, what did they go through for us to be here today? That's kind of how I always think of everything. I'm honored to be a librarian. What did librarians do? What did my family go through for me to be here? And when I walk through a graveyard, that's what I'm thinking about. How did people get us here? I moved to New England. I'm a New Yorker. I moved to New England because of this rich history. And I hope that you appreciated how people came over and they settled here. I was talking to a gentleman earlier today. His family has owned the land for hundreds of years. That's amazing to me. I come from an immigrant family. So to have a graveyard that's 300 years old is absolutely amazing. So these are my graveyards from my childhood. My dad worked on Wall Street, and on father-daughter days, he would bring me downtown. We would take the Long Island Railroad in and then take the subway, and we would go to Trinity Church on the way to Wall Street. And we'd walk right through, and that's Alexander Hamilton's grave. And when I was doing the research online, it said Alexander Hamilton of musical fame. And then that's Robert Fulton of Steamboat fame. And I was just amazed and looking at his face and thinking, you know, back then I did value the art, but I didn't realize that's what I was valuing. Look at that carving. It's absolutely amazing that they did that. So we would walk through this. One thing that really struck me during 9/11, I don't know if you remember the pictures on television of things raining down on Trinity Church. That was one of the main images they showed, which is really poignant. This is where our founding fathers are buried. And I could feel what happened no more stronger than I could when I associated it with what was happening to Trinity Church. Another graveyard that meant something to me, this is where my family was buried, or is buried, at Mount Carmel Cemetery in New York. There are about 119,000 people buried here. This is in Queens, New York. You would get lost if you tried to find your family. Somehow my dad knew just how to get there. He would wear his tallis, and we would stand by all of our ancestors. He would say Kaddish, which is Jewish prayers of mourning. And then we would leave stones on the stones, because we don't leave flowers in the Jewish religion, we leave stones. And you can see one right here. So there are stones all on the ground, you pick one up and you put it on there. So for me, this cemetery meant love, ancestry. Again, what did all these people go through for me to be here? And you could get lost. This is so much different than the Plains Cemetery. But I'm sure my feelings of it are the same as the people who have family buried here. More personal than when you go to see your founding fathers. And then the final cemetery that made an impact on me is this one in East Northport, Long Island, which is where I was raised. As I remembered it before I did the research for this, I thought it was an old Native American burial ground. And the story in my head was, this used to be Modell's. I don't know if anybody knows Modell's. It was kind of like Kmart in New York. And people told me that Native Americans were buried there. As they dug up for the parking lot, they disturbed this grave and reburied people. And well, when I started researching it, it's the Burr family burial yard. But I went to my husband, who was raised in the same town, and last night I said to him, do you remember the story of that graveyard near Modell's? And he said, yeah, I remember they said Native Americans were buried there. So I started thinking about my folklore class and how stories get told, you know, the spooky stories of graveyards and then Native American burial grounds and ghosts, and that stuck in my head, and that wasn't it at all. And I used to visit this, so why did that story stick in my head? What stories stick in our heads that aren't true? So this is the one image I've included that is also in the exhibit, which is right up front to the left of the screen. This is from historic New England. This is a mourning picture of John Bartlett and his wife. The beautiful, strange thing about it was made decades after their death. So it shows how the people we honored, the founding fathers, were still honored decades after. It was important enough for somebody to make that picture to honor them. We're still doing that today. We're still building monuments to George Washington, and you know, cemeteries tell the story, and deaths tell the story of those who came before us, and they're part of our legend as Americans. I thought it was so interesting, and Ernie thought this one was interesting. This is a common form of art. They also made them, this one here, that one's a stitch, cross stitch, the other one's a painting. Usually it's your family you're doing it about, but they did that about John Bartlett. So right here, right in our Plains Cemetery, is one of the most important people in our country that people are valuing. But I also included some other mourning pictures as an art person with an art history degree. I hate to call myself an art historian, but I wanted to show you some other kinds of mourning pictures. Photography was coming into its own. So that's an actual picture of a family. The girl is not living. So you can see that she's clearer because she's not moving. They had to keep the shutter open for so long, but it was fine for her, and the others were moving a little bit, so they're not as clear. And then this is made out of hair, which was very common in Victorian times, but seems very strange to me. They'd also make rings and put hair in rings or necklaces. These are material culture, just like our gravestones are, made by people to commemorate people. So I haven't been following my notes. I'm going to look down to make sure I didn't forget anything. So there are a few things I want you to remember when you go around looking at the exhibit. I have a few more things to talk about after this, but what I want you to remember, I wanted to pull out the highlights rather than talking about each picture. So what I got out of the research is, so we know Portsmouth was the capital of New Hampshire in our colonial days. Kingston was the 5th town in the colony after it separated from Hampton in 1694, and it played a central role early. There were a few Puritans in early Kingston. Most of you probably know this, but some of you don't, so bear with me. That influence can be seen on the imagery on the gravestones, which will be highlighted in our next exhibit. So those, what we call wings of death, it looks like a death mask or a skull with the wings. That's a Puritan image. And then over time, it evolved to be an image of a person instead. So we were focusing on ascending to heaven, then we were focusing on heaven, and then we were focusing on the mourning, which is what we see here with the weeping willow. The focusing on the mourning is more of a 19th century image. Early Kingstonians were mostly Congregationalists, and I do want to call out that the Congregational Church is also celebrating its 300th anniversary this year. I believe, and we need to do more research, somebody in this room may know, that if the cemetery was started by the Congregational Church, if there is a relationship there, you're not thinking there was. Okay. Because it was the same year, and often the people who founded a town were the founders of the church, and the first thing you're going to do is also found a cemetery, so we'll have to talk more. Kingston started as a frontier town and then became a centralized New Hampshire trade route. Kingston's rich natural resources supplied Portsmouth with timber. I was talking to Ernie yesterday about a gravestone that has logs on it. Somebody called it out. So the guy was a lumber worker, right? Well,
It was part of a, called the Woodmen of the World. It was an organization that he actually belonged
okay, so there was that wood connection, but did you know that Kingston Plains used to be a lumber yard way back when? So all these historical connections I was trying to make, I thought that was fascinating. Because it was this trade route where people were taking timbers to Portsmouth to build masts, and you see in Fremont there's a sign about them doing the same thing, all these little towns did. Kingston became home to many taverns. I think there were 15. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong about that. They were supplying travelers with the sustenance they needed for their journeys. Also because of that, so you'll see a picture, we don't have a picture of a tavern, but I showed a business because the businesses were thriving, the taverns were thriving, all of this was developing around the Kingston Plains. So this exhibit I set up to talk about the plains and its relationship to the cemetery. You'll see in the corner, that's something from Harvard that I found, that talks about the pandemic that they believe started in Kingston and then spread. And because Kingston was a center, the people were all going through, the doctors, the ministers, were catching this disease and just bringing it all through New England, and they think it started here. So when you think about I was saying every AP student knows that trade, disease, all are related to all of history. Those are the most important things, and Kingston's history shows those important elements. Finally, I want you to remember as you look at the exhibit, but I do have more to talk about, so it's not a finally, okay, get up and go. Kingston was also the place where Josiah Bartlett settled. So I do invite you to come look at that picture because it really is incredible. But we are tied so strongly to early American history, patriotism, and something Americans at the time called a virtuous republic, which could supply the greatest happiness for the greatest number is what they looked for. And I think these are still values in American society today. So there's no place you can feel that more than in the cemetery, because that was their intention. So cemeteries are open-air museums. Have you ever thought of them as museums? No. I went to, I worked at the Museum of Fine Arts for a short time. I interned there. And they had gravestones in there because the gravestones were falling apart in Boston and they didn't know what to do with it. So they actually put them in the museum, which is a shame because well, it's great because they're trying to preserve it, but it's also a shame because there's something about that connection to nature and that man-made material that you don't get anywhere else except in a cemetery. Cemeteries are also time capsules. They're representative of a time and place. So one of the interesting, I still like to go to cemeteries, one of the interesting ones I saw lately had photographs of the people with little symbols built into the stone of things they were interested in or things that were meaningful to them. So compare that to the death's head symbol, very different. Cemeteries are memorials to individuals as well as communities. They're places for contemporary pride, and one of the things I'm hoping we get out of this year is how prideful we should be of this cemetery, because it's unusual, and it really does tell the story of Kingston. I'm not from Kingston. I don't live in Kingston now. I wish I did. I love this place because rarely do you feel this kind of history, and right off the plains, there's that cemetery tying it all together. It's a spiritual place. There are places that remind us of something bigger. There is something bigger than ourselves, whatever that something is. As soon as you walk into a cemetery, you feel it. So I'm going to end by talking about some major cemeteries that aren't exactly like our cemetery, but you can see elements of the plains there. So this is Granary Burying Ground in Boston. This is where the Anglicans were buried, the Loyalists. That's King's Chapel right there. And it's special because that's where we know our founding fathers are. There are a lot of our founding fathers there. This stone is particularly interesting, the tapping stone. I should have gotten a bigger picture, but it's death trying to snuff out the candle of life and someone trying to hold them back and stop them from doing that. So when you talk about the art of gravestones, that's pretty amazing. But we do have some pretty amazing stones to show you from our cemetery as well. This one is Mount Auburn Cemetery. So we moved from that time period of religion and graves being established so we can go see our family to a more romanticized view. And art changed at that time with the Weeping Willow, and we were romanticizing. It was a time of manifest destiny where we want to move west. So we were on the frontier in Kingston. People are looking to the west. We're ready to go. And that's what Mount Auburn Cemetery is all about, this idea of beauty. It is everywhere, and nature is endless in the United States. So if you've never been to Mount Auburn, it's one of the best known cemeteries in the world, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And then finally, I have Arlington Cemetery, which you can see elements of the Garden Cemetery. It was around the same time as Mount Auburn, but yet it also has a feeling of our own cemetery. With the trees in the background, this is the plains, things lined up. It looks so much better now. So much of this is cleaned up now. Kudos to our DPW for cleaning out some vegetation that was invasive, and all the people who've been out there cleaning up the stones. And this is a newer part of the cemetery. You can see, you can feel the trees and that nature connection. And I just want you to, as you walk around, keep that feeling inside of the beauty and the spiritual and the connection to something greater than yourself. And that's all. So thank you all for being very attentive. I appreciate it.